All right, in this discussion, we are going to talk about performance evaluation and performance management. And in this discussion, what we are going to do is to look at performance appraisal into 10 different but consecutive and connected steps. Okay, and I hope that you will learn more about the reasons why are we conducting performance evaluation and how does it help both the company and the employees being evaluated. So let's start. Okay, so have you ever felt that your teacher has given you a grade that you do not deserve? So I guess this is an experience that all of us can relate to because even though you're not yet working at the time that you were listening to this lecture, then perhaps at some point in your life you have been evaluated, and you have been evaluated before, not by your supervisor at work because you're not yet working, but rather you were evaluated in the classroom by your teachers, or you were evaluated, let's say, by your parents, you were evaluated but by your peers. But most of the time, most of us here would say that we felt that we have been evaluated by our teachers. However, believe it or not all teachers are very good when it comes to giving grades, and we're not, and when they are not very good in giving grades, then it means that perhaps they are not so good when it comes to measuring performance, or they may have their certain biases, or perhaps they have very high standards or very low standards for a teacher. That's why you have to ask yourself at this point, do you agree with all evaluation feedback that you have received? Because I know that sometimes, even though you got evaluated by your peers or by your teachers or by your supervisors, you have the feeling wherein you say to yourself that I know I'm not this good, or I know that I'm not this bad. Okay, so what I'm trying to tell you here is that in performance appraisal, although we try to be as objective as possible, of course, there will be a lot of extraneous variables that will come into the mix that will disrupt the objectivity of our assessment of workers. And that's what we're going to discuss in today's discussion. All right, so here's the 10-step process of performance appraisal that I'm going to share with you. And what you can see here on the screen are the first six steps in performance appraisal. And then we're going to discuss them one by one. So we shall begin with number one, determine the purpose of the appraisal. And then number two, identify environmental and cultural limitations, followed by determining who will evaluate performance. And four, select the best method to accomplish goals, and then train raters. And then for number six, observe and document performance. So if you're going to look at the right side of the screen here, you will see three sets of words: as needed, annually, and daily. So in other words, you do not have to do all these processes every day, but rather you need to follow a schedule in your organization or in your company. Say, for example, according to our graph here, numbers 1 to 4 should only be done when it's needed. Why? Typically, if you enter a company, they already have a purpose why they are doing performance appraisal. That's for yearly appraisal or quarterly appraisal. So that they already have a purpose. So you will only change the purpose if it's necessary. Same goes for identifying environmental and cultural limitations, because most of the time, the HR is aware about these limitations, hence they know when and where to give the evaluation tool to those who will evaluate, and determine who will evaluate the performance. So um, this doesn't need to be changed every now and then unless there's a major organizational change that is ongoing in the company. Perhaps there's a change in management. Okay, so you don't need to do this every now and then, only as needed. And same goes for selecting the best appraisal methods to accomplish goals, because I don't think that your company will change its appraisal method every time that you will appraise someone. Most of the time, it will stick to what is working. Okay, and they do not change it unless there's a problem with what has been working for quite some time. And annually, what you need to do is to train raters. So do not raters may not be that objective when it comes to rating. That's why they need to be trained, they need to be aware how to use the tool and how to eliminate the biases in one's objectivity. So the recommendation by our author here, Amot, is to do it annually. Okay, do it once a year. No need to do that every month or every quarter. Annually, annual arrangement would do fine. But there's something that you need to do daily, and that is observing and documenting performance. This is not something that is done by all supervisors, but this needs to be, um, supervisors needs to engage in this more often, because when it comes to performance evaluation, most supervisors don't know their employees too well. That's why they only rely on their first impressions or recent impressions of that person. That's why for you to be more objective, of course, you need to observe and document performance, may it be good or bad performance, because it provides immediate feedback as needed. So it gives you an idea about the fluctuation and the performance of this person. Other than that, if you know that earlier today person A committed a certain mistake, then you can correct him immediately. Okay, so that's the advantage of observing and documenting performance daily. Okay, and here are the other things that you need to remember. Okay, of course, you need to evaluate performance when it at the time the performance appraisal, and then you need to communicate these results to the employees, and then if necessary you need to conduct personal decisions, whether to promote, to retain, or to fire that individual. Of course, that has a lot to do with the performance evaluation of that person. And lastly, if it's needed, monitor the legality and fairness of the appraisal process. Okay, so yes, you have been using the same tool for quite some time, but is it disadvantageous for certain personnel? Okay, so those are the things that I want you to realize as we go along through this lecture, and what are the different issues that exist in performance management. So let's begin with number one. The first step that you need to do in performance evaluation is to determine the reason why you are evaluating employee performance, because there are various reasons to do performance appraisal. Okay, and in some company they use the same reason every time they do performance appraisal, while there are also some companies wherein if they do appraisal semi-annually or quarterly, they have different goals for those different periods. Okay, so here are the different possible goals that you might pursue in doing in a performance appraisal. Meaning, if you do performance evaluation, then most of the time here are the goals that you're trying to achieve. Number one, providing employee training and feedback. So performance evaluation doesn't only help us give an objective feedback about how a person is doing in his or her job, it's also our chance to identify in which areas is this person struggling, so that we can provide the right training. And training is the topic that we are going to talk about in the next lecture. Okay, and like what I told you, it's because there's no such thing as a perfect employee nor applicant, and the training will compensate for what that employee is lacking. Okay, the reason why you need to do performance appraisal first before training is that not everyone is in need of training. Say for example, there are some, now that we are adapting online learning, maybe there are teachers who were forced to undergo training on how to do online learning, like for example, in elementary school, in senior high school, etc., or even in college. They were forced to undergo online um a tutorial on how to handle online classroom. But if you did not do performance appraisal, then you will not be able to know who is in need of more attention or more training. Okay, and the other way around, maybe there are some attendees in that training that already know what is supposed to be done, hence they're somehow wasting their time by attending training because they already possess those skills even before being trained. Okay, so now I hope that you realize that. So if you did well in the recent performance appraisal, then it also means that you can also be exempted in certain trainings that is required for you as an employee. Okay? So other than that, feedback about what employees are doing, right or wrong. So feedback allows us to correct the mistakes that a person has committed, but other than that, it allows us to reinforce the good behavior. So other managers are there to always criticize or demoralize, especially if they're what's this, very strict managers, or very moody managers. So they make use of performance evaluation to terrorize their employees. But remember, a good leader will not only point out the mistakes but also point out the good things that have been coming since that employee has been doing a good job. Okay, so always remember that as a good leader in a company. And number two, determining salary increases. So if you really want to reward someone because you know that this person is loyal, committed, hardworking, he goes beyond the requirements of the job, then maybe because of organizational politics, if you suddenly rewarded that person, other employees would get envious, or they might think that there's some politics behind it. So in order for you to be free of these issues or not be involved in such rumors or gossip, what I advise you to do is to increase salary based on an objective rating or based on an objective assessment. So you can back up your decision that you have increased person A's salary because you can tell them that person A got the highest rating in the most recent teacher evaluation or employee evaluation, um, employee performance evaluation. Okay, so that will provide a fair basis in determining who among the employees will receive salary increase. Because most of the time, or at sometimes there are also employees that are very hardworking yet they're quiet. That's why their managers don't know them that much, so they also deserve to have a salary increase. But most of the time, those who are close to the managers or to the executives are the one who gets the attention of the administrator. So to be more objective, why don't you conduct performance appraisal? And number three, making promotion decisions. So other than increasing salary, of course, it will also be perceived that it's fair if you promote based on performance appraisal results. Okay, so similar reason with number two. Then, if performance appraisal allows us to promote someone, it also allows us or give us a reason to terminate someone. So there are some instances wherein a certain employee wanted to be kicked out by his or her peers. However, how are you supposed to kick someone out of your company if you don't have an objective assessment of that person's performance? If I tell you that I'm firing you because I don't like you, and your coworkers don't like you, how will that make you feel? Okay, so that will make you think that I'm biased or I just want to get rid of you. But if I was able to present an objective basis of my decision, then I'm showing you that I'm not being biased in my decision, but rather there's a reason why I decided to terminate you. Okay, there are a lot of people who are complaining that they got terminated or they got fired from their company. So I hope that you undergo the right process, and I hope that there wasn't any politics behind it or any injustice involved why you were terminated or fired. And I hope that your managers or your executives were able to present an objective source of information why you were terminated or fired from your company. Okay, because that's the due process that you need to undergo when someone is getting terminated. And lastly, but I think that this is not a very famous reason why we conduct performance appraisal, but for people like me who like to conduct research, performance appraisal is also one avenue for us to study the behavior of the employees. Because when we conduct performance evaluation, you're answering tools, you're answering surveys then wouldn't that be a good chance to administer research instruments as well, so that they no longer have to answer the instrument in another time, but rather just compile it into one questionnaire, then give it to the employees. Okay, so you can conduct research about personality of the people in your company and their performance, and I would guess that consensuous people will get higher scores, like what we told you in the previous discussion, and that consensuousness is a great predictor of employee performance. Or you can study a lot of different topics in your company, like turnover intention, or wanting to quit, or job crafting. We will discuss job crafting in our other lectures, and job engagement, job satisfaction, etc. Okay, so you can, combine those questionnaires into the questionnaires that you give out to the employees during performance evaluation period. All right, so another thing that you need to consider when doing performance appraisal is step number 2: identify environmental and cultural limitations. So is this the right time and place and right avenue to do performance appraisal, or are there some limitations that we need to address first? Okay, so say for example, if supervisors are highly overworked, then performance appraisal, which is time consuming, may not be successful. So they might end up not being able to accomplish the performance appraisal tool, or they may end up giving very low ratings. Next, in an environment in which there is no money available for merit pay, or pay when it comes to or bonuses for good performance, then developing a numerically complex system will become frustrating, and the results of the evaluation will not be taken seriously. So, in other words, of course, people would like to be rewarded for performing well in their jobs. So if they don't get any reward for good performance, then they may not be motivated to do well in their in their um in their job. Okay, so merit pay or bonuses for good performance will also be helpful in motivating people. Okay, so other than that, cultural and environmental factors may also play a role in this. Okay, but this is not so evident in the Philippines because most of the time we rarely work with foreigners in the country. Okay, most of the time a team is composed by all Filipinos, so cultural factors may not be that evident. Okay, I can share more about step number 2 in relation to the current situation wherein most of us are working from home. So in the most recent semester, I think that I did not go undergo performance evaluation as a teacher. Why? Because it was the time that the COVID pandemic was at its peak in most of the countries. That's why perhaps the executives have decided that this is not the best time to conduct performance evaluation, especially that the situation is very disadvantageous for everyone. So, as a responsible industrial psychologist, you need to consider these factors. Okay, and in an environment in which employees are very cohesive, the use of peer ratings might reduce cohesiveness. Okay, so there are some instances wherein people are very close to each other. That is why what happens is that they give very high scores to their friends or to their peers. Okay, so according to research in industrial psychology, evaluating your peers might reduce this cohesiveness because of various reasons, but I guess that it may have reduced the cohesiveness of a group because if you try to be objective in the way that you rate others, maybe you will find a reason to give a low rating or high rating to one group, to one member, but not to the other member. And if your peers find out about this, then there might be some jealousy, or they might be envious about the status of their peers, hence their group unity or cohesiveness is being reduced. Okay, then after steps 1 and 2, the next thing that you're going to do is to determine who will evaluate performance. So there are a lot of people who can evaluate performance, but most of the time and traditionally it has been the responsibility of the supervisor. However, due to organizational behavior research, organizations have realized that supervisors see only certain aspects of an employee's behavior. So in one research, it was observed that the manager might observe only 30% of the teller's work behavior. The rest is observed by customers, peers, support staff, etc. In other words, we are now moving towards a newer way to appraise performance, and that is not solely the responsibility of the supervisor, but rather more people are involved in performance evaluation, knowing that a certain person may act differently when the supervisor is present, or the supervisor may not have enough information to evaluate the person. Okay, so that's one reason why we are involving more people in the performance evaluation process. Okay, so what I'm talking about in the previous slide is um, a performance appraisal technique wherein more people are involved in the performance evaluation. Hence, more companies are using what we call 360-degree feedback, or what we call multiple source feedback. That's why in schools, they also try to implement this, wherein students can evaluate their professors, and in turn, professors are encouraging students to evaluate their peer performance, because traditionally it's the professor who will do everything, all of the evaluation when grading a student. But right now, we can also, or professors can also get information about the person's performance by getting the objective ratings from his or her peers. Okay, so now let's talk about the technicalities of why do we have to conduct performance evaluation wherein more people are involved. Because there are instances when we evaluate ourselves, our evaluation of our own performance may not match our peers' evaluation of our performance. And looking at this table here on the screen, we can see that the most reliable, or in psychological terms, the most consistent out of all possible combinations would be the agreement between two supervisors, and that's a 50.5 a point 0.5, or a 50 correlation coefficient. Okay, so that's a moderate correlation. While looking at the bottom here, the most unreliable, or the most inconsistent performance evaluation results would be the ones coming from the peers and from the self. It's only 0.19. So it means that perhaps your peers evaluated you very strictly, but you evaluated yourself very leniently. That's why your evaluation does not match with their evaluation of your performance. That's why its correlation is very low. Okay, so by far the most common source of performance appraisal is the supervisor rating, because by 2013 there were still around 74% of organizations relying on supervisor ratings. So what are the downsides of this? Its possible downside is like what I told you earlier. They may not be able to see every minute of that employee's behavior, but the good thing is that they see the end result. So in other words, comparing supervisors with peers, supervisors see the result of an employee's efforts, but peers often see their actual behavior. Just like in the classroom, your classmates see your behavior when the teacher is not there, while your teacher will see your final project result. Okay, so there's a reason why teachers involve the students in evaluating their peers, mainly because of the first bullet in this slide. Okay, so peer ratings usually come from employees who directly work with an employee. So it would be difficult for you to ask for peer ratings, but that employee doesn't really know, or is not really close to the person that he or she is evaluating. So that's problematic. Okay, so now research suggests that certain employees are more lenient in their peer ratings than other employees. Of course, when you're friends, then you might talk to each other that you should give a high rating to each other. However, that's not always the case because Saavedra and Kuhn found that high performers evaluate their peers strictly than low performers. In other words, better workers tend to be more strict when it comes to evaluating their peers. That's why better students may have the possibility of giving their peers lower grades. Why? Because they compare the performance of their peers with their own performance. So those are the potential biases that may influence peer ratings. Okay, and another source of information in the 360-degree feedback is the feedback coming from your subordinate, also known as upward feedback. Okay, however, subordinate ratings may be difficult to obtain because employees fear a backlash, okay, from their supervisors, specifically if you rate them very poorly. So in other words, this is very problematic, especially for those wherein their unit, say for example, is only composed of three people, the supervisor and then the two subordinates. So if the supervisor got a very low score, then it's easy for him or her to identify why did he or she get a low score. It's only because of the two subordinates, because there are no other subordinates, so those two subordinates can expect a backlash from the supervisor, especially if they're not so close to each other, or if the supervisor is not so professional. Okay, that's why you also need to be brave enough to accept the ratings of your subordinates, because they also work with you and their rating can help you improve your performance. And finally, some organizations may ask feedback from their customers. And typically, like before, I gave feedback to a KFC branch in a mall near our place. And then typically they give a reward for participating in their survey. That's why people are enthusiastic when it comes to answering the survey, because typically they get an ice cream or a dessert for doing so, and it's easy to fill up. Just look at the right screen here. It's yes or no question. Okay? Because this is also considering that not everyone who eats at your restaurant, or not everyone who goes to your company as visitors, are trained to evaluate good performance. Now that you have determined who is going to evaluate performance, the next thing that you're going to do is to select the best appraisal method to accomplish your goals. And there are a number of appraisal methods that I'm going to talk about in this lecture. Okay, but first let's look at the major considerations. Okay, so first is that focus on appraisal dimensions. Okay, so in which areas are you going to evaluate your employees? So you can focus on things such as traits, their competencies, their tasks, types, and their goals. Okay, and then the next decision is that should dimensions be weighted? It means that the four things that I talk about, traits, competencies, tasks, and goals, typically they don't get equal weights, but rather one would weigh heavier than the other. Perhaps a certain company would give more importance to goals compared to traits, while some companies would say that traits are more important than tasks. Okay, so it will vary from one company to another in how they distribute the weights among various appraisal dimensions. So here are some specific examples of the various areas of concerns we have under the different categories or appraisal dimensions that I've mentioned to you. When we talk about competencies, they talk about the very specific skills, such as driving skills or public speaking skills. They're very specific. But when we talk about task focus, okay, this may be close to competency focus, but the difference is that task focus is broader than competency focus, because in doing a task, you need to use a lot of competencies. Okay, so say for example, public speaking skills for a police officer may be important in giving a court testimony, or writing skills may be important in what's this? Um, Logging or making making an incident report. Okay, so those are the bigger tasks wherein you need these different competencies. Okay. And then a bigger umbrella compared to the other two is the goal focus approach, because in reaching a goal, you perform various tasks. So this is broader than the first two. Okay. And these examples are the examples under these are arresting lawbreakers, finishing the shift without injury, um, minimizing citizen complaints, assuring public safety, etc. So, what is the advantage of being broader in your approach compared to a more specific approach? Okay, so say for example, a police officer may not consider going to driving school or enhancing his or her driving skill because driving is not the same with police work, or it does not define police work. However, if you allow them to realize that driving is an important competency for him or her to reach the important goal, which is called arresting lawbreakers, then that person or those people in the police force will give more importance to driving. So the same goes for training. If they don't know why they're learning how to use Excel, then don't expect them to do good in Excel. Okay? So that's my example for the first three. While trait focus is a lot different compared to the other three, because it's about the characteristics such as honesty, courtesy, responsibility, etc. So it depends on your company, which is it that you value in your company. Okay? All right, so now that you have decided on the dimensions that you're going to evaluate, still under step four is to you is knowing which type of performance appraisal approach are you going to utilize. Okay, so once the dimensions have been considered, the next decision is whether to number one, evaluate performance by comparing employees with one another, or two, to use objective measures such as attendance and number of units sold, or three, having supervisors rate how well the employee has performed on each dimension. I think we have already discussed the implications of number three. So now let's discuss number one and two. In number one, what it's saying is that it's suggesting to do performance appraisal by comparing the employees with each other. Okay, so that may sound nice, but that's also problematic. While number two is to do performance appraisal without the need to compare them with each other, and but rather rate them individually. Okay, such as does he or she have good attendance, or what about his number of units sold or his or her efficiency. So let's take a look at the different appraisal methods that will cover either number one or number two, and I want you to decide which of the two do you think is better than the other. Okay, so first let's talk about number one, wherein it involves comparing them with each other. And the first technique that I'm going to share with you is called rank order. Okay, so in rank order or ranking method, what you're doing is, for example, you have five subordinates under your name as a supervisor, as a manager. What you can do is to rank them from 1 to 5, wherein the top one is the best, while the number 5 or the top 5 is the poorest performer. Okay, so that's one thing that you can do, rank order. So let me show you an example in the next slide. All right, so here's what he did. So for example, here are the five people under your unit. So what you can do is you can rank them according to knowledge. Like Barina is top one in knowledge, while Underwood is top two in knowledge. But when it comes to dependability, Barina is still number one, and then Hicks is number two, and then quality, of course, he's all still number one. But when it comes to quality, Underwood is better than Hicks. Okay, so what he did eventually is to average those ranks, and then the of course the lowest should be the top one, top two, top three, top four, and top five. Sounds easy enough, but it's hard, especially if their performance are very close to each other. And it's also difficult to do if, say, for example, you have 10 people in your department, or 20 or 30, then how are you going to rank them when it comes to dependability, knowledge, quality, etc. Say, for example, you are managing 50 Grab or Uber drivers. Do you think this will be effective? Of course not. Okay, that's why there are some weaknesses in using ranking method. Another way of comparing employees to each other is to do paired comparison technique. When we say paired comparison, my dear students, what we're doing is that if you have five people in your department, what you're going to do is to compare person 1 with person 2, 3, and 4. Okay, so just like what you can see here on the screen. So Green is better than Briscoe, Green is better than Ray, etc. While Logan is better than Ray. So what you're going to do is to to compute how many combinations you're going to come up with, and then list all those combinations, and between the two, who is better. Then in order for you to determine that a certain employee is doing well, is to count how many times have you chosen that employee over another employee. That's why Green ended up as the top one, because he was chosen 4 times over another. Okay, so that's the paired comparison technique. And what's the weakness of this approach is the same with the weaknesses of the ranking method, because it will be very hard to compare them with each other, especially if, say, for example, you have 20 subordinates in your department, right? Just imagine how many mathematical combinations would you have to rate and compare with each other. And the last employee appraisal that relies on comparison with each other is what we call the force distribution technique. And this might be a little bit confusing for some of you, so listen carefully on this one. In the force distribution technique, okay, what you're going to do is basically you will determine if person A belongs in certain categories, such as is he terrible, below average, average, good, or excellent. Okay, so in your performance evaluation sheet, what you can see there is basically categories from terrible to excellent, and then you can see percentages: 10, 20, 40, 20, and 10. Okay, so in other words, how to use this is, for example, if you have 10 employees, it means that 40% can be categorized as average. So in other words, 40% of 10 is 4. So in other words, you can have 4 average employees, okay? While you should put the rest in other categories such as good, below average, excellent, and terrible. Now, what's the weakness of this approach? The weakness of the force distribution is that, what if Lawrence is actually in average? But you cannot put Lawrence in average because you cannot put him because it's already full. So, in other words, following the force distribution technique, you need to put Lawrence in other categories. And then this supervisor decided, I'll just put you in good because anyway, that's close to the middle. Okay, and anyway, I like you as an employee. That's why I'm going to put you in good. So that's a little bit unfair, right? Especially for the 4 in the center, because performs their performance is similar to the performance of Lawrence. However, Lawrence was given a good rating while they only got an average rating. So that's problematic, right? Other than that, because it's called force distribution, you cannot leave any of these categories blank. So in other words, you really have to assign one person or 10% in terrible. Okay, what if no one is terrible in your unit? You still have to find someone who looks or appears terrible. And because, say for example, you're angry toward Roberts, you put Roberts in the terrible rating. Does Roberts deserve a terrible rating? Perhaps not. But because of first distribution, he thought that his performance is terrible. Okay, so that's one reason for you not to use force distribution technique, because you're forced to fill up these categories, but not all the time there are terrible, nor very good, nor excellent employees in your unit. That's why do not rely so much on employee comparisons. And after this, we're going to discuss the more objective ways of rating performance. Okay, so the second way to evaluate performance is to use commonly called objective or hard criteria. So what makes it objective is that we're not comparing them to each other, but I'm evaluating you as a student, not in comparison to other students. So I evaluate your attendance, your quizzes, your grades, etc. Okay, so that's an objective way of appraising performance. Now let's talk about the specifics of objective measures. Okay, so let's take a look at different objective measures of performance. The first is graphic rating scale, wherein on a scale of 1 to 5, you have to be rated from poor to excellent. What can we say about your initiative, your cooperation, dependability, and attendance? So basically, you know how to use this. This is similar to the Likert scale in psychological testing and assessment. So that's for graphic rating scale. Other than that, we have what we call behavioral checklists, wherein we list the different possible tasks that you need to do, and we determine by simply checking or leaving it blank if you were able to perform these different behaviors. Okay, so it's very easy to use. And other than that, here's another possible format of your behavioral checklist. Unlike what I showed you earlier, wherein there's a list of tasks and then you have to check or leave it blank. In this example, you can also design your behavioral checklist in this way, like similar to the up to what we talked about earlier. You can still compare with another employee, like does he do better than other tellers, or say for example frequency. So how frequent is the good behavior, or how frequent does he greet customer, always, almost always, etc. And the extent to which organizational expectations are met, so greatly exceeds expectations. So basically like rating your students using rubrics. Okay, so these are some of the objective measures that I'm going to share with you. And then what we're going to talk about in the next steps are the issues when it comes to the side of the raters and what they need to know in order for them to rate employees objectively. Okay, so now that you have decided on which performance appraisal method you're going to utilize in your company, the next issue that you have to address is you can ask yourself the question, are my employees ready to conduct performance evaluation? Because most of the time, they are not familiar, or perhaps they have forgotten how to be objective on how to rate in a fair and an unbiased manner. Okay, so the next thing you need to do is to train your raters. Again, hopefully you can do this every year or annually. So that's what I mean by that. So what you can do is to conduct a frame of reference training, or wherein you allow them once again to appreciate the vision, the mission, the goals of your company, and then from those visions, you allow them to specify what are the different tasks or goals that you need to accomplish. Okay, so you need to provide them information about the job, the practice. You need to provide them practice in rating, and then examples of rating. Perhaps they can practice with, say, for example, Google Sheets or Microsoft Forms or any other rating tools that you're going to utilize. Okay, so, and as well as the rationale behind those ratings. So why do we need to do performance appraisal? Okay, so just like in therapy, you psychoeducate them, then they realize the importance of therapy. Same goes in industrial psychology. If you educate them about the importance of performance appraisal, then they will have a more positive attitude towards performance appraisal. Okay, because doing a frame of reference training increases rater accuracy and reduce rater errors. Okay, so it allows you to be more accurate, because if you have done a frame of reference training, it will allow you to know, so what is the goal in this company? See, for example, what is their goal every day? Is it their goal to target 1 million every month? Is it their goal to target 20 incident reports every day for one employee, etc.? So if you don't know these things, or if you have been negligent about these things, then don't expect that you will also be objective in your rating. Okay, what if you rate others based on your own performance? Then that can make you lenient or strict. Okay, so it's important to remind them once again of the goals of performance appraisal and the goals of the company, etc. And the better the employees understand the performance appraisal system, the greater their satisfaction with the system. That's why as teachers, we make sure that our students know the grading system, and other than that, they know the rubrics when it comes to projects, because typically students will complain that they got a low score, but if they know the rubrics, then they get satisfied and they realize that they do deserve that rating because they did not follow the standards that were set by their professor. Okay, now let's talk about the specific things that an employee can do to be more objective, and that is what we call observing and documenting performance. So as a responsible supervisor, what you need to do is to, if you have a lot of subordinates or if you're very keen about observing your subordinates, then it is advised that you should have a logbook of critical incidents. And when we say critical incidents, these are the important employee behaviors that you want to remember, because most of the time you overestimate your capability to remember things. Going to back to cognitive psychology, we think that we will remember something even though that we will eventually forget those things. So to help you remember, you should have a logbook or a diary of good performance of your subordinates, of their critical incidents. So you can log there that today I like the performance of person A because he helped the elderly in opening the door of the restaurant. Okay, even though that's not part of his job. So those critical incidents are very important when the performance appraisal period comes, so that it will remind you of the good things and the bad things that an employee has done, and then your biases will be reduced. Okay, critical incidents should be communicated to the employee at the time they occur, so that you can either reward or punish them. Reward them if it's good, or punish them if it's bad. Okay, here's the importance of documentation. Documentation forces a supervisor to focus on employee behaviors rather than traits. Because typically, in a collectivist culture, specifically in the Philippines, if the person is good, even though he or she is terrible, then supervisors or managers end up giving high ratings. See, for example, teachers like students who listen a lot. But what if the student pays attention, or he's very kind but he does not possess the what's this the he does not possess the skills in order to pass the course that he is or she is taking. So that can be problematic. And number two, the documentation helps supervisors recall, like what I told you earlier, and documentation provides examples to use when reviewing performance ratings with employees. So it gives you exact examples, so you will not rely on traits. And documentation helps an organization defend against legal action. So what if employee A gets angry because he or she was fired? Then he might say that it's because the performance appraisal system is unfair. But if you have critical incidents logbook, then you can show them that you were you can show to the authorities that there's a legal reason why this employee was terminated. It was done in a fair and unbiased manner. So same with students. If students or parents came in complaining that their students failed, even though their child failed the course, even though the child doesn't deserve to get a failing mark. So what a teacher can do is to present the grades and show that these are the performance criteria that I'm looking at. So your child was not able to fulfill this criteria. Maybe he's always absent, etc. So that protects you from any legal ramifications. Okay, so when you don't document, here are the possible sources of error, or you tend to rely on these things, even though it should not be the case. It's just, for example, first impressions or recent behaviors. Remember, we call these primacy effect for first impression, and recent behaviors we call this recency effect. So let us not rely on these things, but rather let us rely on our documentation. Same goes for unusual behaviors. What if you only remember the time that he went to work so early or extended until very late at night, but in his everyday behavior he is terrible? But because of that one day that he worked so good, you gave him a very high rating. So that reduces the objectivity of your appraisal or evaluation. Okay, and then perhaps your own opinion will also, will also influence your rating of this person. So document in order to avoid these possible sources of errors in rating performance. Okay, so now you're ready to rate the performance of your subordinates or anyone else in your company. In order for you to do so, let's talk about step 7, evaluating performance. What you need to do in this stage is first to obtain and review objective data. So that's why I told you about documenting performance earlier, because you are now going to use it. And if you don't have notes, then you will rely on least reliable sources of information. Okay, and that involves, and this objective sources involves reading the critical incidents logbook. Okay, that's why it was recommended earlier that before you rate, you should have a list of good behaviors of this employee. Okay, and then once you're ready to rate, of course, what you can do is to complete the rating form. Okay, and while making these ratings, the supervisor must be careful not to make common rating errors involving halo error, proximity error, and contrast error, which I'm going to talk about in a moment. Okay, so we can eliminate errors when it comes to biases in rating performance during, and even before rating the actual performance. That's why we talk about performance appraisal in a step-by-step process. So what are these errors that I mentioned to you earlier? So there are 3 possible errors when it comes to rating. So the first one is leniency, or the tendency to give very high ratings to everyone even though they don't deserve it. These are the raters who on the scale of 1 to 5, they only give around 4 or 5. Okay, so they don't give 1, 2, or 3. Wherein we also have what we call central tendency error, wherein you only give ratings in the middle. So you only use 3 or neutral. You don't say good or bad. So that's another source of error. And the last type of error would be strictness, or the rating every employee at the low end of the scale. So in order for you not to commit these errors, you have a lot of factors to consider, such as your rate critical incidents logbook, and your own subjectivity must be eliminated so that you're purely objective when you are rating employee performance. Other than that, here are the possible sources of error from a psychological assessment standpoint. We also have what we call halo error, wherein a rater allows either a single attribute or an overall impression of an individual to affect the ratings he or she makes on each relevant job dimensions. So when we say halo error, just because of one good attribute, you get a high score in every other attribute. This is different in leniency, because in leniency, everybody gets a high rating. While in halo errors, one person got a very high rating because of one single good attribute. Say for example, if employee A has good attendance, you have the tendency to rate or give him a high rating in responsibility, what else? Honesty, and so many other things. That in reality, he or she just have good attendance, but he is not that responsible, he is not that efficient, he is not that honest. That is what you call halo error. One good attribute affected your overall impression about that individual. So these errors must be avoided. Next, we also have what we call proximity error, and proximity errors happen when a rating made on one dimension affects the rating on the dimension that immediately follows on the rating scale. Say, for example, questions number 1, 2, and 3 are about honesty, and because this person is very honest, he really deserves to get 5 on all those 3 questions. The next questions, number 4, 5, and 6, are about good attendance. In reality, this person has poor attendance even though he's honest. So he deserves 1 or 2 in those questions. However, because it came after honesty, there's a tendency for you to stick on giving high ratings. Okay, so that's proximity error. So what you can do is, perhaps when you use online ways of evaluating, you can randomize the questions so that proximity errors will be minimized. Okay, so you will not be able to know that questions 1 to 3 are about honesty, and then you give him high rating on those questions, and then you will also give him high rating on the questions will follow. Perhaps it's good if the questions are spread so that you will not think that these questions are about responsibility, but rather you cannot identify the different subscales in rating performance. Of course, that's just my suggestion and how you can address proximity errors. We can also have contrast errors, or this is brought about by performance rating one person received can be influenced by the performance of a previously evaluated person. So say for example, person A is good, and then the next person that you're going to evaluate is person B who is average. Because person A is good, person B looks bad, even though he's average, he was rated poorly. So that's contrast error. Sometimes the order of the people we're going to evaluate also influence who gets a high rating and low rating. That's why let's also try our best to reduce contrast errors and try to be more objective. So this is a summary of what we have talked about. If you suffer from leniency error, everybody gets a high rating. While if you suffer from strictness, everybody gets a low rating. Central tendency, you give 3 to everyone. You don't give either 1 or 2 or 4 or 5. While with Halo, if an employee is good, then he appears to be good in everything. If an employee is average, then he appears average in every criteria. But if he or she is bad, then you have the tendency to give him a low rating in all the criteria. So that is Halo error. Okay, then after you have rated your employees, you need to give them an idea about how they perform in the most recent performance evaluation. So just like teachers, they were given an idea how was their performance in the previous semesters. So that's one good benefit of frequently doing performance appraisals so that you can give feedback immediately to your employees about their performance. So you can reward or either punish their bad performance. So normally in most organizations, a supervisor spends a few minutes with employees each year to tell them about the scores they receive. Okay, so that's a good behavior that a manager can, demonstrate towards his or her subordinates to allow them or give them time to understand their scores and know in which areas he or she can keep improving. Of course, when you give your feedback about the performance of the person, we cannot avoid that there will be negative feedback that we have to give. Okay, so one of the best ways to present negative feedback to an employee is not to flood them with negative feedback, but rather utilize what we call sandwich effect, wherein you give at the first part you talk about the good things, then at the middle you talk about the bad things, and at the end you talk about the good things again, so that your employee will leave the room with a smile. Okay, so that he will not only be aware about the bad things, but you can also reinforce the good things that he or she has done recently. So utilize the feedback or the sandwich effect when you are giving feedback towards anyone, like your group mates, towards a speaker, towards anybody else. So utilize the sandwich effect. Then if necessary, then after performance appraisal, that will be your chance to terminate someone. Okay, if he or she is not really performing well. And in step number 9, what we're going to talk about are the different things or reasons for you to consider termination. So number one reason is probationary period. So it's legal to terminate someone if his or her probationary period is already over. You just need to make sure that your employee is aware of this ahead of time, and you're not going to surprise them that their contract has ended. And number two, it's also a legal reason to terminate someone if the rules of the company have been violated. Okay, so but in order for you to be objective in doing this, you should make sure that the rule that was violated must exist. So if a rule exists, the company must prove that the employee knew the rule. Okay, so you cannot be unequal when it comes to enforcing the rule. You cannot let other people go while other people have to get the consequences. So that's there's injustice in your company. Or you cannot punish employees for something that is not written in the rule book. Say, for example, you have caught your employees buying stuff from each other, and then you tell them you're not allowed to sell stuff to each other, especially in the office, but there's nothing about that that has been put in the rule book. So why are you punishing them? Okay, wouldn't it suffice if you reprimand them and then include that in the rule book in the future? So make sure that everybody knows the rule. So that's the reason why you have the manual, or in the case of the employee, the employee handbook, or if there's a sudden change in the rule, the memo. Okay, so you must make sure that they know, your employees know the rules. So just like laws, rules cannot be cannot be retroactive. So if the law or the rule has been passed or has been written in 2020, you cannot be punished for something that you have done back in 2019, because rules and laws are not supposed to be retroactive, but rather they're supposed to take an effect at the time that the law was passed or the rule was, written in the rule book. Other than that, another reason for you to legally terminate someone is the inability to perform, or maybe although the employee is trying his best, his skills are really not enough to handle the position. Okay, but even though it's a legal reason to terminate, make sure that the employee will undergo the due process for termination. What you can do is to apply progressive discipline. So do not terminate someone just because of one absent or one late, but rather try to reprimand first. That is progressive discipline. You don't terminate right then and there. You go step by step, like verbal warning, written warning, suspension, and then finally termination. You cannot skip steps and go to termination immediately. Unless if the violation is will really result to termination. So it's advised that you need to use progressive discipline. Okay, and you also need to consider who are you going to terminate. So most of the time, older employees are not terminated easily because even though they did something bad, the good things that they have done will outweigh the single bad thing that they have committed. So you need to consider, who is it that we are going to terminate? Is termination really necessary? Or can we give a demotion or a verbal warning or a written warning? And the last legal reason for you to terminate is because of reduction in force or layoff. So maybe because of like the pandemic, or because of losses in the company, you can do layoff or force reduction. Okay, and then of course you need to support your employees in this process, and you need to explain to them why is there a need for a reduction in force or layoff. Okay, so that's step number 9 in performance appraisal, and I'm not going to discuss that much on step number 10, which is monitoring the legality of your performance appraisal system. But I want you to know that basically it's similar to what I've been talking about in terminating employees. You need to make sure that everybody gets evaluated fairly, it's not unbiased, you do not rely on your impressions or opinions, but rather you are objective in the way that you rate each other, because you maximize critical incidents logbook, or you try to identify and minimize possible errors, such as factors in the environment, factors in the workload, etc. So basically, that is it for our 10 steps to remember in rating performance. And I hope that from this point forward, you'll be able to give more importance to employee performance appraisal, knowing that rating employees will have a lot of positive psychological outcomes, both to the employee and to the employer. So that is it for this discussion, and thank you.